All right, tonight we're in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, and we're going to finish it tonight. And the reason we're going to finish it is because we're down to a unique section now where we can go really rather rapidly. I really want to call your attention again to this situation, and that is that when we begin to talk about faith, we must understand that God speaks, that man hears, and man does two things. If man has faith, it means he accepts what God says, and then it means he puts his trust in what God says. And when you put your trust in what God says, that means you do what God says. There. So now, tonight, we're going to be starting out with Isaac. So let's look down now in our Bible to chapter 11 and verse 20. And as we look down here, we are going to notice we'll be able to go rapidly tonight. Tonight we will finish the 11th chapter. Now, what the writer has done is he started out and he gave us a lot of teaching about faith. And we could spend a lot of time in showing about it and what really is all involved in the study of faith, and how Abraham or Noah, he built the ark by faith, which means he heard what God told him to do. That fantastic story, something nobody had ever heard about, they had never dreamed about, they had never thought that it was possible for it to happen. But God spoke to him, he heard him, he put his trust in him, he believed him, and he worked 120 years. And when it was all over, then it says, by faith, then he built that ark. And on we go. Now then, tonight, we're going to be down to where we're going to take several different people. He's just going to go zip, 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 zip. And then when he gets down, he's going to say, and what more can I say? And then he's just going to give us a list of a bunch of names and say some things to kind of encompass it. Here's what we are to get out of this class tonight. We're to get out of it what the writer put in it. And so when you ask, why does he give us all of these examples? And in these great big examples, he only uses one little verse. And he jumps from here to here to here to here to here to here to here. And then in one verse, he will put 6 or 8 people all together, and then he say, and there's a whole lot more. So what he's trying to get us to see is this. That is, that the Bible is full of stories of people living by faith. That all the way through, from Genesis down to now, God has always saved people by faith. That's always been the basis that he has worked on. That's the basis that he saved Abraham on, was by the faith that he had. And on you go. So what he's trying to get us to see is that all of the faithful people, hundreds and hundreds of faithful people in the Old Testament period of time that was faithful and pleasing to God, there was one thing that made them so, and that is their faith. And when you think about that faith, that's a big word. That's why I keep going back and emphasizing that you hear, you put your trust in it, and you do what he tells you to do. And sometimes it's a lifelong thing. How many years did it take Noah to express his faith? 120. How many years did it take Abraham to express his faith? I haven't figured it out, but it's all of his life, wasn't it? See, he spent his whole life from the time God called him just going out and doing this and this and this and this. So his whole life was one that was bound up in faith. He would do this, then he'd do that, then he'd do this, and finally God called on him to sacrifice his own son, but it took his lifetime. And so that really is what we need to look at. That faith is something that we live by all of our life. We let that guide us in there. But faith is not a nebulous thing. It's a definite thing. You hear what God says, and you put your trust in what God says, and you do what he says. Now, just briefly, we're just going to make brief comments tonight on each one of these. Story starts out and he says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even concerning things to come. Period. That's it. Now, he did that by faith. Well, when you go back to the Old Testament, you can go back and you can read, and there you can see what Isaac did. And he blessed Jacob and Esau, and he brought Jacob in. And now we understand there was deception in here, don't we? See, boys, but that's not part of our story. So don't even think about how Jacob deceived him. Jacob deceived him, and Isaac made this promise in there. He said, God give thee of the dew of the heaven, the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and new wine. Let peoples serve thee. That means let nations. And nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren. And let thy mother's son bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that cursed thee. Blessed be everyone that blesseth thee. Now, he gave this to Jacob. Now, when he gave this to Jacob, did Isaac have any way of looking into the future and knowing this would come true? No, he didn't. On what basis would Isaac ever have given a promise like this anyway? I mean, I wouldn't call my son in and give him a promise like this. And if I did, you'd say, I'm crazy, Lowell, it'll never come true. But Isaac gave it, and Isaac expected it to come true. On what basis? What's that? God had spoken it to Isaac's father. God had told Abraham, this is what's going to happen through your seed. So now then, Isaac, he passes this blessing on. And he knows what God has said, it's going to happen. He had no way of seeing it's going to happen, but he called his son in and gave him the blessing and says, this is what is going to happen in this. I think it's interesting that if you would read the whole history of Jacob and Esau, you would find that the Jews, the Israelites, came out of Jacob, and the Edomites came out of Esau. And as you look at it, it appeared for many years that Esau was going to conquer Jacob, didn't it? You remember how that Esau ran him away from home, and when he came back, who was scared of whom? Jacob was scared to death of Esau, and it appeared that this promise was just going to be reversed. And then when the two nations came on after these two boys died, then again it looked like it might be reversed, because the Edomites could come in and it looked like, they were enemies and they could conquer Israel. But as you go on, you see history just goes on and on and on, and finally the Edomites were destroyed and the Israelites continued on. So it actually happened then in that way. Well, the next statement that is Jacob. So he says, now concerning Jacob, this again is a very, very brief statement he makes. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning upon the top of his staff. So Jacob calls in his sons, and he does this also. Now, when he calls them in, here's the way that it went. It said, it came to pass after these things that one said to Joseph, now Joseph was Jacob's son. He said, behold, thy father is sick, and he took him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So now, these would be the two grandsons of Jacob. And one told Jacob and said, behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee. And Israel strengthened himself, and that's Jacob, that's the other name for Jacob, and sat upon the bed. And Jacob said unto Jehovah, God Almighty appeared to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said unto me, I will make thee fruitful and multiply thee. I will make thee a company of peoples, and I will give this land to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession. So now Jacob said, God has spoken to me, and God has said he's going to make a great nation out of me, and he's going to give me this land. So he said, now I want you to go get your two sons. So he went and got the two sons. Now, I don't know, maybe somebody knows more about the story than I do. You found some little item in there. But why he got the two sons, I don't know exactly why he chose them, rather than just leaving Joseph there. But have you ever noticed there's no tribe of Joseph? When you look at the 12 tribes, there's no tribe of Joseph. It sounds funny when you say the tribe of Joseph, and yet he was one of the 12 sons. But he was not considered as one of the tribes. And here's what Jacob did. Jacob told him, he said, I'm going to skip you, and I'm going to take your 2 sons. And he blessed the 2 sons, and he said, now these 2 sons will become mine. My grandchildren are going to become mine. In other words, they're going to become my sons. Now he said, just like the rest of them, and he said, now the other sons that you have, they can be yours. But I'm going to take, he says, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, have you ever heard of the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Manasseh? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? See? All right, now, here's the whole point. And this story doesn't tell us why he did that. I don't know why he did that. I would like to know why he did that. But that's not the point of the story to tell us why he did it. Here's the point of the story. He did it. He called them in and he said, now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take these 2 grandchildren and I'm going to give them a blessing because, and it was based upon what? Because God has spoken to me and God told me that I would become a great nation. And so Jacob then is passing this blessing on because God spoke, he heard, and now then he's passing the blessing on to his children. Now, let me ask you this. Here's 2 things. Are you as impressed with these 2 acts of faith as you are with Noah and Abraham? How does it leave you if I ask you to compare the faith of Noah into, let's say, this thing, or the faith of Abraham? You'll say, well, there's absolutely no comparison whatsoever. Abraham spent his life. Noah spent 120 years. There's no comparison. So let's learn a lesson. When we act by faith, how long does it take to act by faith? How long does that action take? I'm waiting on some smart person to tell me. It depends. What's that? Yeah, it depends. It could be 1 minute. It could be 30 seconds. God could tell somebody, do something, and he does it. That's an act of faith. Or he can tell Noah, build the ark. I'm going to cause the rain in 120 years. So Noah spent 120 years in building the ark. So this is what he's trying to get us to see. We're to live by faith. When you hear what God wants you to do, what is your responsibility? You do it. You do it. Okay, the next one comes along then, and it's Joseph. Now, Joseph goes down into Egypt. We know about that. And it says, by faith Joseph, when his end was nigh, that is, when he was about dead, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. So now, here's Joseph down in Egypt. How long would it take us to tell that story? Where's it start? Back in Genesis 35, something like that. It goes through Genesis 50. And all of those interesting things you remember, the coat of many colors, and all of that's not part of it. That's not part of what he's talking about here tonight. He said, I want to call your attention to something Joseph did. When Joseph was an old man, and when he was just about dead, he called his sons in, and he says, when you leave this land, I want you to take my bones with you. Don't you leave them here. He said he did that by faith. You said, well, what did that have to do by faith? What indication did Joseph have that his people would leave Egypt? God had promised Abraham. Remember? God had promised Abraham. He said, Abraham, and then he told him, he said, your seed's going to go down for 400 years, and then I will bring them up and I will give them the land. See? Now, God had told him that 400 years ago. Joseph is about dead. Now, how high up on the totem pole was Joseph in the realm of authority in Egypt? He was really the ruler. I mean, Pharaoh was over him in authority, but he was running the country. And you would think that if he was that powerful, that his family probably would be just ensconced within the land, is what you would think as you looked at it. But Joseph called him in and said, now you're going to leave. You're going to go back to that country. And when you leave, take my bones with you. And he did it by faith. God had spoken it 400 years before. He accepted it. And so he mentions it here then by faith. That's what I mean. These examples we get just one after the other that goes down. And it doesn't take long to look at them. But this is the point that he's wanting us to see. Hundreds and hundreds of people did things, some that just took that long, but they did it by faith. Moses' parents. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a goodly child and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Now, again, this is a lovely story, a wonderful story about a mother's love and all of this kind of thing. Maybe you can help me again, because we're getting into some things here where I don't know if God has given us some answers. Now, he says, by faith, Moses' parents did this. And I know faith cometh by hearing, hearing by the word of God. But I don't know what God told those parents. Does anybody else, you got any indication? It just seems to me, as we read the story, it said they looked at him, they saw he was a goodly child, they were not afraid of the king's commandments. That's kind of an interesting statement, because they were afraid of the king's commandments. How do you know that they were afraid of the king's commandments, even though he said they weren't? They hid him. They hid him for 3 months, and then they built that little ark and they put it out there. Did they just walk up there and give it to Pharaoh? No. They scooted it out in the water. They were afraid. But the Bible says they were not afraid. What do you mean? Can you be afraid and not afraid? Yeah, you sure can. You sure can. Suppose that somebody came in here right now and said, they had a gun, and they said, I'm getting ready to kill some people. I'm gonna pick out one guy. I'm going to show you I'm getting ready to shoot him. Do you think I'd be afraid standing up here? Me? No, I wouldn't be afraid. My knees would be buckling. Yeah, he's probably going to get me, see? Yeah, I would be afraid, see? I certainly would be afraid. But now, suppose I got to hold myself up. My knees are shaking. And they said, who do you want me to kill? And I say, well, sir, I'm the teacher. Go ahead and kill me. Am I afraid? It depends, isn't it? Yeah, I'm scared to death, but I'm willing to give my life, you see, to save your life. And so you'd have to go away and what do you talk about? Well, some of you would say, well, Lowell was scared to death, wasn't he? And some of you would say, he wasn't afraid, and he went on through with that situation, see? That's what they did in here. Don't ever get the idea that great people in the Bible were not afraid. Don't ever get the idea that the Apostle Paul went through life without being afraid. He made some statements that showed that he was really concerned in there. But it was by faith. So, for somehow or another, and I don't have the answer to that. Anybody got one? Select.
Moses was 3 months old, so it wasn't Moses' faith.
No, it was a parent's faith. And I'm just wondering what indication they had is all that I'm getting at. And here's the point that I'm trying to make. The Hebrew writer is telling us all of these people lived by faith. See? Now, it may be, here's the only way I can think of it, is, remember, faith is made of 2 parts. What are the 2 parts? Hearing what God says and putting your trust in God. Remember, we've compared it like with hope. Hope is what? Desire plus expectation. We use the word hope just meaning desire a lot of times, don't we? I hope something. We just mean the desire in there. So there's 3 ways that you could use it. And I would understand that's probably what it is. That they were putting their trust in God rather than as soon as the little baby boy was born, they said, let's go feed him to the crocodiles. That's what they were supposed to do, see. They hid him. They put that little ark out there, and they were putting their trust in God. It's one aspect of faith. I suppose that's what it is, but I don't know. Okay, next is Moses himself. Now here's a real act of faith. By faith, Moses, when he was growing up, refused to be called son of Pharaoh's daughter, refusing rather to share the ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. A lot of things to study in that. But again, we come back in here by faith. Now, this is an interesting thing. How did Moses know he was a Jew and not an Israelite? I would expect that's what's happened. Mama had him and taught him during his youth, and so he understood, he knew he was an Israelite. And he understood, he had been taught these things, so that he knew God is with the Israelites. The Israelites will eventually conquer. So Moses knew this, and finally when it came down to the time of when he had to make a decision, and we all remember about him having to make the decision, don't we, about him killing that fellow, and then bing, 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 and all of this comes in. So he had to make a decision. Now, he could have gone back. He could have made that right, but he counted. He said he had made a decision. He had determined, I would rather suffer ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Now, I might ask you this. How bad was the ill treatment of the people? Just about as bad as you can get, isn't it? How good was the pleasures of sin for a season in Moses' shoes? Absolutely as good as you can get. He was the richest man on the face of the earth. He made a big decision. He didn't make just a little decision in there. Accounting the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. Now, we say, what does that mean, the reproaches of Christ? I would understand it to mean really this. I don't think that Moses was looking and thinking, now Christ is going to be reproached, and so I will suffer like that. He didn't have that idea. They didn't understand the Christ in that way. But it's just like you and I would endure the reproaches of Christ. Paul made this statement, and I rejoice in my suffering for your sake, and fill up on my part that which is lacking of the afflictions of Christ. So when Christ died on the cross, was there any more suffering that had to be done in order to bring God's plan to fruition? Now, he died on the cross. Nobody else is going to die. But is there any more suffering? Suppose the 12 apostles had said, I'm not going out and preach because we're going to get stoned, we're going to get killed, we're going to get all of this. I'm not going to do that. Would God's plan have been complete? No. They had to go out and preach the gospel to the whole world. And when you suffer for Christ, you're suffering the reproaches, the same kind of suffering that Christ had to suffer, and you're suffering it for Him. And so that's what I would understand in that. Well, after that, Moses decided, and we know what it cost him. He had to leave the country, go out, spend 40 years in the mountain. And in there, it says, by faith he forsook Egypt. So he had to make that decision when he knew the Pharaoh was getting ready to kill him. Shall I go back and make it right and apologize and tell a few lies and make this thing right? Or what will I do? Well, he forsook it. He said, I'm leaving Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Now again, not fearing the wrath of the king. Do you suppose he was scared a little bit? If it wasn't, it was kind of an odd way in which he left, wasn't it? He didn't go back up to the king and say, now look here, buddy, I'm leaving, did he? He took off, see? But like his parents, sure, fear goes into you, but he still did what God told him to do. So remember that. When you're called to a point to where it's really going to cost you, and you're scared if you tell the truth. You're scared if you do the right thing. It's normal. But just make sure you don't be too scared to do the right thing. See, that's the key in all of this. So he endured as seeing him who is invisible. That's the reason he was able to go and endure all of that, is he could look ahead and he could see him who is invisible. By the way, that takes us back to the first verse, doesn't it? What is faith? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, and it's the conviction of things not seen. I haven't seen God, but how sure am I that there is a God? I'm sure enough that I'm ready to go out through that desert. Probably the way I'm going to have to go is I won't have any water and may not live. But he had the conviction there is a God, you see, that is in there. So it tells that Pharaoh was going to try to kill him and so forth. That's in there. But let's move on. Moses did another thing. He kept the Passover. You say, why was that by faith? I want us to put ourselves in Moses' shoes just in this way. We know the story of the Passover. That's not it. But I want you to put it in there. Here it is. He has been up there and he's been fighting the king, the Pharaoh. And things are getting down to where it's really tough. It's getting down now to where it's really bad stuff. And so finally, the Pharaoh then tells him, he said, just go ahead and get out. Just go ahead and leave, in here. So he tells him, no, don't do this. So finally, the Pharaoh cut him off and said, you're not going. You're not going. Made that decision. So God told Moses, he said, okay, Moses, here's what I want you to do now. The Pharaoh has legislated, you're not going. These games are over. You remember the 10 plagues? 9 of them have been passed. Pharaoh's changed his mind. Now you are not going. So God called Moses and said, Moses, I tell you what I want you to do tonight. You go tell all the Jews that what I want you to do is take a lamb, kill the lamb, take its blood, and put it up on the lintel and the post. That is, put it up around the top of the door and down on those boards beside the door. I want every Jew in here to do that. I want you to kill that lamb, and I want you to eat the lamb with bitter herbs, and I want you to do it with your clothes on and your walking stick in your hand. And I want you to eat it until it's all gone, all night long. But you stay ready, because you're getting ready to go out of Egypt. Now, if you had been given the order from Pharaoh, the game's over, you are not leaving my country. And then God told you, yeah, you're getting ready to leave, and you're going to leave tonight. And what I want everybody to do is put that blood around there, take that lamb, kill it, and eat it. And while you're eating it, keep your walking stick in your hand. Stay ready. Keep your walking stick in your hand. What? Does that make sense if you're given that instruction? Why would Moses and the Jews do that? Only by faith. That doesn't make any more sense than building an ark. It doesn't make any more sense than sacrificing your own son. That's what he means by this. By faith, Moses kept that Passover. So they went and they kept it. And then you know the story. What happened at midnight that night? That's when the king's son died, and they got ready and they were going to leave. Okay, Moses then, as they left, they went out, and by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land. We know the story. They took off, went up there, they got in that little cove that's up there. They couldn't go anywhere, and there's the Red Sea. And so they look back, and what is it that's coming after them? The Pharaoh's army has finally got it together, and they're coming as fast as they can. Would you be scared? What did all the people cry out? Why did you bring us out here? Did you just try to bring us out here so we would get killed? Why didn't you leave us alone? They were scared to death. Did Moses know what to do? He knew what to do. How do you lead this mass of people across that Red Sea? And God said, Moses, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Watch me go to work. I want you to turn around, take your walking stick, and hold it out over the sea. And he did. And what happened to that sea? It parted. Now, is that the way you go about parting a sea? Stop to think, does that make sense If you and I needed to get by a creek out here somewhere, and I told you, hey, run up there and get a limb and come out and hold a limb over the water, what would you tell me? See? Stupidest thing I've ever heard. See? That's not the way you do it. And yet, that's what God told him to do to the whole sea. Now, why would Moses do such a childish, unbelievable thing as that? Turn around and say, stand still! Watch the salvation of the Lord! Why would he make such a fool of himself? By faith. God told him to do it, and then God parted the sea. Told him to. Do you see all these things coming into play over and over and over again? God speaks, man hears. Man puts his trust in what God says, and you do that by what? Obeying. You do it by obeying, doing what God tells you to do. Okay, then we come to Joshua. You remember his story, the walls of Jericho falling down? Another thing that, wow, that story, I want you to go over. Now, you stop to think, how long had those citizens, those Canaanites in Jericho, how long had they been prepared for war? All their life, they were a warring nation. They had great, gigantic walls. What about Israel? How many wars had they been in? Where had they been? Running around in the wilderness for 40 years. This is going to be the first city they come to when they cross the river, Jordan River, to come over into the land of Canaan. They don't have any fighting instruments. They don't know what to do. They're not a warring nation. And God says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go up. We're going to take Jericho. I want you to walk around Jericho one time each day for 7 days and blow your trumpet. Next day you do it. Now, the city was not too big. Think about, let's take 6 blocks of Monroe up in here. That'd be about what it was. We're not talking about Seattle or something. But you got these great, gigantic walls, these walls that are as high as this building, see? Great, gigantic walls. That's their foundations are still there. Steve, how wide are those foundations? Just the cornerstone that we were looking at. What 12 feet? Something like that. You see, all stone, great gigantic walls. How many sledgehammers did the Jews have? No problem. Walk around them. And I want you to do it one time for 6 days and blow your trumpet. Then on the 7th day, I want you to march around 7 times and blow your trumpet. And when you come around the 7th time, the walls will fall. Have you ever heard of such an idea as that? That's as ridiculous as parting a sea, isn't it? See? In other words, these things that God's saying, I want you to see there's so many times God has told people things that just, it goes against all common sense that any human could possibly have. Let me ask you, there's something God knew that you and I didn't know, but we found out afterwards. Do you know why those people at Jericho didn't jump over that wall and come out and just whip those people to death? That's what they should have done. You know why? No, during the 6 days. Why didn't those soldiers go over the wall and come down and just wipe them clean? Wouldn't have been any problem for them. Rahab tells the story. We have heard about what your God did back in Egypt and what your God has done there. And it said, our hearts have melted like water. We're just absolutely scared to death. God knew that. Normally, those men would just jumped over the wall and destroyed him. But they go around there for 7 days, and then when they blow the trumpet, what happened? It fell. They go in and they conquered. See? And when they did that, then what made the walls fall? By faith. By faith. There. So we can see it just over and over and over again. Rahab's in there. She had heard about this God. That's how we know about it. She had heard about him. And when the spies came in, did she make a deal? And the reason she made a deal is she knew who was going to win the battle, didn't she? She said, when you come back, we know what's going to happen. Would you save me and my family? That's faith, see? That's faith. Then you get down, he says, and what shall I say more? For time will fail me if I talk of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. Somebody tell me how long it would take to tell the story of all those people. If you're going to look at them, just pick out David. How long would that take? Or Samuel? How many books written from Samuel? And the prophets, how many prophets were there? So he said, he's trying to get us to see. He said, I want you to understand that all of these Old Testament characters. Now remember that for our next class, because he's going to tell us we have a great cloud of witnesses. You and I, we have people who have gone on before, and they're looking on us, and they are expecting certain things from us. So he said, what can I say? And so he uses them and just names off a whole lot of them to try to impress us in there. He said, who through faith? Now here's what you could find all those people do. They subdued kingdoms. They went to war when there was no reasonable way of winning a battle, but God told them to go, and they went and they won. They wrought righteousness. They worked righteousness. They remained righteous even when they had to give their lives. They obtained promises. God would give them a promise, you do this, I'll do this, and they did it on that basis. Let's just take one, for instance. When God told Moses, turn around and put this out here. Now he said, watch for the salvation of the Lord. He's promising, I'm going to give you salvation. Turn around and put it out here. When he put it out, how long did it take him to obtain that promise? Immediately. See? It was there. Now I want you to remember that, because in the last verse, we're going to have the thing just reversed in here. Then they stopped the mouth of lions. Well, this happened a few times, but who's the one that you always think about that stopped the mouth of lions? That's Daniel, isn't it? They quenched the power of fire. Who did that? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness they were made strong. They were made strong. Elijah. How weak was Elijah when he hid in that cave? When he hid in that cave and he was back there and God was calling him, he's scared to death and sitting back there. What do you think of Elijah? Was Elijah a courageous man, or was Elijah a real weak man? Well, in that cave he'd given up. He said, Lord, they've killed all of them except me, and they're trying to kill me, and just take my life, Lord. And the Lord said, get up and get out, and took him out and showed him. And by the way, when God wanted to use an example of how great John the Baptist is going to be, John the Baptist is going to be a man, he's going to come and he's going to face the Jewish nation and he's going to tell you what to do. You people repent, because he's coming in the spirit and power of Elijah. Yeah, weakness turned into strength in there. Waxed mighty in war. They turned flights of armies to aliens there. Women received the dead by resurrection. You remember that? A couple of ladies. One was Elijah and one was Elisha. And God raised their sons for them in there. And so he's trying to show us all of these people do things. Here's a whole bunch of stuff they did. Then he comes down and he says, now I want you to understand, when these people lived a life of faith, it wasn't a life of fun. And others were tortured, not accepting their deliverance, that they might obtain a better salvation. I'd understand that to be a better salvation than a resurrection than if you didn't do it. You're going to be raised from the grave to be condemned. But they were tortured, and they could have accepted their salvation, but they didn't. And others had trials of mockings, where people laughed at them and mocked them, and scourgings, that means beating, and moreover bonds, that is thrown in jail, tied up, in prison, same thing. They were stoned, many of them killed by being stoned. They were sawn asunder. How does that make you feel? They were sawn asunder. They were put on a big wheel. Just imagine a great big wheel. Tie your feet here and tie your hands up here, and your back is over this, and they stretch you out. They stretch you out. And then they beat you. And then sometimes they take a saw and just saw you asunder while you were alive. All you had to do is renounce God. See, all you had to do is say, I'm sorry. But they were people that lived by faith. They were people that said, we'll pay the price. They were tempted. They were tempted in many ways. In this, he's not talking about some little temptation like I'm tempted to have a cookie when I go home or something of this nature. But here it is that you're in poverty and perhaps starving and your children are starving. What kind of a temptation would it be if you were offered riches, see, for your family that's out here? And so they endured those things. They were slain with a sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins. They didn't have the normal clothing that they had to wear. Being destitute, totally broke. They were afflicted. They were ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy. In other words, while they were doing all of this thing, the Old Testament people, the world wasn't worthy. If you look at Noah, was the world worthy of Noah? See? And when you take the world that persecuted all of these people, the world wasn't there. They were wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes of the earth. That's where they had to live. But they were people of faith. They were the people that said, when God speaks, I'll believe Him, and I'll put my trust in Him, and I'll obey Him. And this is the cost that it cost them at that particular time. And these all, after having had witness borne to them through their faith, received not the promise. Now they'd had witness borne to them through their faith. In other words, God had told them, here's what you do. For instance, let's take Abraham starting out. Abraham, through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Now there's the witness, God's witness. What was it that Abraham did? He believed Him, didn't he? In other words, it was his faith. And how strong was his faith? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, absolute assurance. It's the conviction of things not seen, totally convicted this will happen. So Abraham was willing to do anything, but they didn't receive the promise. What do you mean, didn't receive the promise? Moses received the promise of the parting of the Red Sea, but now then keep in mind, none of these people had received the promise. What promise do you suppose that they might be talking about? You remember that chart we see so often? God purposed before the creation of the world, He would send Christ. And Christ would die on the cross and establish His church. Now then, you go through all these things. There's a period of time God gave promises and pictures and prophecies and all the way through these Old Testament characters, and they were there. But look in verse 40. God having provided some better thing concerning us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Now what would that mean? We, us. God has provided some better thing for us. Without us, they would not be made perfect. Well, when Christ died on the cross, He established His church. Who is us? See, that's the church. That without the church, without the kingdom, these people back there would not have the promise to come true. The only way they could be made perfect or complete, they suffered and they died because they believed in that promise. They suffered and they died because God said, through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. They suffered, they died, family after family, person after person, living by faith, and they suffered and they died. What would have been their life if all of a sudden Christ had said, I changed my mind. I'm not going to purchase the church, or I'm not going to purchase the kingdom. What would they have lived for? Nothing. What would Abraham's promise have been worth? Nothing. It wasn't fulfilled. But His promise is fulfilled in us, in the kingdom. You and I are actually living the end result of all of those things that those people suffered for. Now, I want us to think about this for just one moment. What's the purpose of the book of Hebrews? Remember how many thousands of times I expect you felt that I emphasized what is the purpose? He's talking to the Hebrew people. And the Hebrew people are doing what? They're getting despondent and they're starting to fall back. And the Hebrew letter is to tell them how much better Christ is. Everything about Christ is better than going back. And do you see how he finishes it? This is the end of the doctrinal section. This is how he finishes it. He's telling the Hebrews, he said, so I want you to see, those of you who are considering and thinking about going back into Judaism, I want you to understand, all of those people lived and suffered and died so you and I could have what we've got today. Don't give it up and don't consider going back. Okay, class dismissed tonight.